All right, let's dive into some U.S. history. Looks like we've got a CSET study guide and some excerpts on figures and events.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot to work with.
It is. So we're going to use all this to figure out how, those first interactions way back when shaped America as we know it.
That's a big question, and it's easy to get lost in the dates and stuff, but yeah, those early interactions, those are key to seeing how this whole thing got started.
Definitely. Okay, so the very beginning, right? Our sources all talk about European exploration. God, gold, and glory. Classic.
Right. Catchy, but there's a lot more to it. Different European powers, they had different approaches to this whole colonization thing.
Totally. Like the Spanish, right. They were super focused on converting Native Americans to Christianity. Missions everywhere.
Exactly. It affected everything, like how their societies were set up, how they treated the indigenous people. It all came back to that religious drive.
It's interesting, though, because the French, they went in a completely different direction. Much more focus on trade, especially the fur trade.
Yeah, alliances were way more important to them. They wanted to work with the Native American tribes, at least for a while there. It was kind of mutually beneficial. Less about taking over the land, more about those trading posts and partnerships.
And then, of course, you have the English. They were all about those permanent settlements. And that obviously meant a lot more displacement of the Native Americans. I remember that from the CSET guide.
Yeah, for sure. That English model, especially in those 13 colonies, land was everything to them. Agriculture, owning land, that led to a lot of clashes, of course. And those had repercussions for, well, centuries.
It's fascinating how differently they approach things. But before we go on to, the Founding Fathers and all that, I want to go back to those very first encounters between Europeans and Native Americans. What can our sources tell us about what that was actually like?
Oh, man, that's such a good point. I mean, imagine it. Two totally different worlds, languages, ways of life suddenly bumping into each other. It was bound to be complicated. Lots of curiosity, I'm sure, but also a ton of misunderstandings.
It makes my head spin just thinking about trying to bridge that gap.
Right.
Were there any specific examples in our sources about those cultural differences?
There was, remember the three sisters, that farming technique, Native Americans, they would grow corn, beans, and squash all together.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It was super sustainable, helped all three crops, and it shows how much they understood about nature, how everything's connected, and a very communal approach, right? Sharing the benefits.
That's a great point. It's so different from how the Europeans saw things. Very individualistic and way more intensive with the farming practices.
Exactly. And those differences, like how to use the land, resources, even spiritual beliefs, that set the stage for a lot of the conflict that came later and really shaped everything that followed.
Wow. Okay, so moving on, we got to talk about the Founding Fathers. Their stories, their beliefs, it's always been so interesting to me. You pointed out this mix of idealism and pragmatism in your notes. What really struck you about them?
It's crazy, right? They were brilliant, but they were also real people dealing with a lot of chaos. So yeah, you have these super high-minded ideals, the Declaration of Independence, natural rights, consent of the governed, the pursuit of happiness, huge ideas, and we're still talking about them today.
Absolutely. But at the same time, these guys are like politicians, right? Making deals, getting land, trying to build a government from scratch.
Oh, totally. Think about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, that whole debate. The CSET guide mentions it, and it shows how these ideals actually played out. Alexander Hamilton, he was all about a strong central government, economic growth, stability. But then you have Thomas Jefferson. He was worried about too much power in one place. He was more focused on individual freedom and the power of the states.
That tension, strong government versus individual freedom, that never really went away, did it?
Nope. Still debating it today. But, with the Founding Fathers, we got to remember they talked about liberty and equality, but slavery was a huge part of their world. That contradiction, it's a big part of their legacy, and it shows just how complicated that whole period was.
Yeah, for sure. It reminds us that even the most, revered figures in history, they were still products of their time. So many contradictions, so much going on.
Exactly. And speaking of contradictions, I think it's time we talked about the transatlantic slave trade. We have some sources that detail the scale of it, how long it went on, and it's something we can't ignore.
Definitely not. The brutality of it, it's hard to even grasp. But to understand the impact, we need to look at how it even started in the first place.
Right. Well, the need for labor, that's a big part of it. Plantations in the New World, all those crops like sugar and tobacco, they needed people to work them. And the European powers, they were all about competition and expansion. So they created this system where humans became commodities. Awful.
I was struck by something our sources mentioned about religion during this period. Events like the Protestant Reformation and the Spanish Inquisition, they seemed kind of separate, but they actually had an impact on the power dynamics that led to the slave trade.
It's wild how seemingly unrelated events can have these huge unintended consequences. And in this case, those consequences were incredibly tragic.
It's like history is this giant web, everything's connected.
Exactly. And the transatlantic slave trade is, well, it's a stark example of how those connections can be devastating. It's a part of American history that we absolutely have to confront, learn from, and acknowledge how it continues to affect our society, our politics, and our economy.
It's heavy stuff, but it's essential if we want to really understand the American story.
Mm.
And speaking of stories, our sources also covered the American Revolution. It's often romanticized in textbooks. What did you learn from our sources that changed your view of this pivotal event?
It's true, yeah. The American Revolution, it's often simplified, like it was just about independence, end of story. But the sources you gave, they show how complex it really was. All those different motivations, the contradictions.
Right, and those ideas at the heart of it all, that's what I find so fascinating. The CSET guide talks about natural rights, government by consent. It's like we take those for granted now, but back then, super radical stuff.
Oh, for sure. Imagine, right, a world where you couldn't even question the king. But these colonists, they were reading guys like John Locke, Enlightenment thinkers, and they started to believe that people have these inherent rights that no government can touch. And that the government, well, it gets its power from the people, not the other way around. That was revolutionary, for real.
It blows my mind how those ideas from the Declaration of Independence, they're still shaping how we think about America today. But I'm curious, like, on the ground, was everyone really on board with this whole revolution thing?
Oh, heck no. It was messy. A lot of colonists stayed loyal to Britain, economic ties, family back in England, and some people just wanted to stick with what they knew. Plus, nobody knew if they'd actually win. It was a gamble.
It just shows you that history is not a straight line, right? It's
Yeah.
all these different ideas and loyalties crashing into each other. Real people making tough choices.
Exactly. And you find these amazing stories within those clashes, like France, right? The Marquis de Lafayette, he was a French aristocrat, but he became a huge supporter of the American cause. Him and the military and financial aid from France. That was crucial for the colonists to win.
It's crazy how global politics, like, played such a big role in the birth of a new nation.
Sure.
But once they won independence, that's when a whole other set of challenges started, right?
Yeah.
The Articles of Confederation, then the Constitution. It wasn't easy.
Not at all. That first try with the Articles of Confederation, it was too weak. The states were bickering, the economy was a mess, and there was nobody in charge to really handle the big issues.